Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and as you can see I've got a little assortment of stuff out of my freezer. I've got a couple banana peels. These aren't from the freezer, these are just some pastries that really weren't all that good, so I'm going to see about giving them to the wormies, see if they like it. And then I've got some pumpkin here, and I've got my my handy knife ready to go because I couldn't dislodge these pieces from one another. I've been letting this stuff thaw out for a few minutes in the hopes that maybe it might be easier to separate some of these pieces, but just in case I need the tool, I've got my knife handy. The systems that I plan on feeding today, they're right over here. There are a couple of European nightcrawler bins. The topic of the last video was all about trying to harmonize these two systems to try to bring them into sync with one another. They kind of got off to two very different starts. And I've got a little illustration that I thought I might share with you before we get started, just to put things in perspective. So let me put on a glove, we'll get back up on the bench with the camera, and we're going to get to work. So the system that we've already got up here on the bench ready to go is the older of the two systems. It's the one that's now 67 days old with 8 feedings applied so far. The other system kind of got launched in a much more conventional fashion. We just did the haul out of the worms of the old system that they used to live in, which made it up to 343 days of age, and then that's been in service for 43 days with 3 feedings and a population of 1,793 worms. This system, on the other hand, the one we're working on first, is the one that had the worms launched into 3 separate yellow buckets set up as breeder buckets, where those worms were left for 28 days, and then they got put into this container here for the past 39 days, leading us to the 67 days in service. I guess the reason they got so many more feedings, 8 feedings over that time, was because while they were in the breeder buckets, I went in there pretty regularly with my worm chow and applied a little bit here and there, and it wasn't a lot, but it was, you know, each counted as a feeding. And what we have in this system here is an estimated 1,752 worms. So somewhere between 1,750 and closer to 1,800 in the other system. Whether those numbers are correct or not, I don't know. They're the estimates that we come up with together. Every time I try to launch a bin with everyone watching, I do my best to show what's happening there as clearly as possible so that I can get input from the viewers and we all kick in our estimates for how many worms we believe we saw. And that's the way those numbers were arrived at. So let's see, I've got a couple top covering pieces of newspaper here. So yeah, like I said earlier, I guess the emphasis on the last check-in was to see what we could do about synchronizing the setup of these two systems. So the feeding they got last time was very similar, and then I went ahead and I put those very similar coverings on, so when I showed both bins side by side earlier, they had very similar appearances to them. And there'll be distinct differences too as we go through, but I imagine that over time these two systems will start to seem a lot more like one another over time. And there's always going to be little differences too. Like I think the second bin received a tomato last time we fed. This one didn't. And on the flip side, this system actually received a half of a corn cob with the kernels on it still. And I only had one of those, so what the other bin got was just some little chunks of corn cob alone with no corn kernels on it. Some minor differences for the most part. We put watermelon in here last time, we put cucumber in here last time. Those are the sort of things I don't really expect to see many leftovers of. But then another thing that we put into each of these systems last time was the stem of a pumpkin. I had a pretty good sized stem of a pumpkin, which I cut in half. I sawed it in half, and part of it went in here and the other part went into the other bin. So combination of stuff which might show no leftovers, like the cucumber and the watermelon, but other things that are almost certain to be still leftovers. Like here, this piece of vegetable matter goes back multiple feedings, perhaps 2 or 3 feedings at this point, and only now am I able to finally chip away at it. Very tough piece of vegetable matter there, and I guess if I had frozen it, that would have helped a lot. The one thing that did not happen with that particular piece of veggie matter was I did not freeze it, as was the case with all these pieces of potato peel. Those things, for whatever reason, I just sort of bypassed the normal prep that most of the foods my worm bins get. Most things make a little pit stop into the freezer to get frozen first, and then just that process of freezing and thawing really does seem to help a lot with the jump starting of the breakdown process. So like, we're already starting to see some of the stuff from the last feeding. Usually the worms really do get to work onto a piece of corn cob that's got the kernels on it still, and they'll usually rip the kernels off 1, 2, 3. It's been 13 days since our last check-in, so I'm a little surprised to find that this thing is virtually intact still. So now what else do we have here? I guess here's the stem of a banana peel. They're going to be getting a little bit more of that today. I already see parts of the watermelon too. Each bin got a pretty good chunk of watermelon. And I can even see some of the leftover bits of the watermelon here. Almost makes me wonder if cramming another feeding in today is unnecessary. You know, sometimes I come down here with food like I did today. Other times I come down with nothing, try to gauge the need, and then tailor the feeding to suit the perceived need. Other times, you know, I just come down here with the assumption that they are going to need something to eat. And that was the way I played it today, so I'm not planning on backing off, even though it seems like we've got some leftovers here, a piece of corn cob showing up as leftovers, a piece of vegetable like this, or like the other one that was over here. Those things are going to take forever. And I'm not going to, you know, force the worms to rely on something like that if it's just going to be something that they can't really rip into right away. So slowly over time, that'll become something that they can also eat, but in the meantime, I'll continue feeding them easier to eat things so that they're well fed and comfortable. And then as some of those slower composting materials mature to the point where the worms can take advantage of it as a food item, they'll eventually move in and start doing away with that stuff too. And then sometimes I run into a material that I'm not even quite certain of what it is. Like this stuff here, I can't even recall what that was. Oh, you know what it was? It's coming back to me now. There too, some pastry. It wasn't the pastries like what we're giving them today, these little kind of rolls with, I don't know, maybe nut or something in there. I believe this stuff was sort of apple, some sort of like an apple strudel sort of a thing. So there's some pastry and then there's some apple on the inside. There too, it's just a material that's going to gradually get eaten by the worms. This is the stem of the pumpkin, so I had an entire stem which I cut in half, put half in here, put half in the other system. So yeah, we've got a variety of leftovers from the previous feedings. Some of it goes back to just the last feeding, some of it goes back even further. You can see there's a good number of worms hanging out down in this system. You know, with this batch of worms in here, having been initially tasked in the yellow buckets, in the breeder buckets with breeding, my hope was that, you know, we'd start to see a little bit of a population explosion happening in this particular bin. Because what happened was I just took those 3 breeder buckets and then emptied the contents of those into this tray. My hope was that, you know, over those 28 weeks that they spent in the breeder buckets, that they would have, you know, utilized that opportunity to expand their numbers, lay down some cocoons. I gotta be honest though, I don't really remember seeing any cocoons. Not while they were in the buckets and I was feeding them, not while I was emptying the contents of the buckets into here. So whether or not that breeding experiment even worked or not, I do not know. But if at some point we start to feel like this system is really jam-packed with tons of baby worms, then we'll know why. But there's always that possibility that it just didn't work as planned, and whatever. That's fine too. I guess maybe there was some imperfections to the method I followed, because I believe it's supposed to be only adult worms, and I didn't really pay that much attention. I just took what I perceived to be a few hundred worms combined with a couple gallons of bedding, and figured, well, let's see what happens. And you know, maybe my lack of attention to make sure it was only adult worms going in to the breeding systems might have been part of the reason I don't see much of a result here. Or maybe there was a result, and maybe I'm just missing the cocoons, who knows. So this is another stem, and I don't know. I don't have some sort of a pumpkin stem fetish going on. The stuff just happens to be tangled up with some of the pumpkin that I'm feeding nowadays, as is the case here, but I'm not going to go crazy trying to separate this stem to make sure the other system gets a piece of it, although if we really wanted to, I'm sure it wouldn't be too difficult, since I've got kind of the right tool here to make that happen if we wanted to. I'm trying to be careful so I don't end up putting a big hole in my hand, because that would not be a fun thing. I was just wondering if maybe we can chip off a piece of this so that both systems are given a fair shake at pumpkin stem, and then each system will get one banana peel. And I think we've got a fair split here. I've even got a coffee filter. I figured if one of our coffee filters was starting to really show wear, then we could swap it out with a replacement. But I don't know. I think the coffee filter I saw in this system was seeming to hold up pretty good. So I don't think it needs replacement here. I guess we'll hang on to it just in case the other system requires a replacement feeding zone indicator. But something tells me the other system's feeding zone indicator is going to be in good shape too. So we've definitely gone pretty generous here on this feeding. I'm going to apply a little bit of this crushed eggshell as the grit to go along with their feeding. And I don't know, I was thinking about putting in some worm chow, but you know, maybe I'll just hold off, because it does seem like we've gone quite generous on this feeding. It seems unnecessary to go crazy. So maybe we'll just start backfilling if I've got any other little residual chunks of food laying out here, like these potato pieces I'm bumping into here and there. Perhaps we can return them back down into the feeding area, and then we'll get stuff covered up. Yeah, there is a good bit of leftover food here and there within this system. Those little bits of potato, those other chunks of vegetable matter, some of this stuff just seems like it's going to take quite some time before the worms can finally rip into that stuff. So I think we'll keep running into some of that stuff as leftovers for a while, but then eventually that stuff will go too. In the meantime, we'll just continue giving them additional food so they've got stuff that they can get right into right away, and then over time those slower materials will eventually become accessible as food for them too, and then they could take care of that stuff as well. Yeah, this is a pretty nicely loaded tub here. Definitely has a whole lot more material in it than most systems that are at this age would normally have in my wormery. It's kind of been my goal lately to provide the worms with a little bit more real estate to roam and explore right from the beginning, because it seems like by giving them extra space, you're going to possibly encourage mating behavior. Yeah, once again, back to the breeding and mating behavior. It seems like a good thing to do, you know, if you can. Why run a tub like this only a quarter of the way full or a third of the way full if you can really be more like what you see here, a little bit beyond halfway full, possibly closer to 2/3 of the way full. Seems like if that's going to be possible without it, you know, potentially causing a situation where things can get pushed off the sides and make a big mess, then why not run it that way? And I think that's kind of the way I'm going to be running most of my systems nowadays, because it seems like a good idea. All right, we're going to return all these top covering bits of stuff. These pieces of cardboard, I guess, are probably unique to this system. I don't think we have pieces of cardboard like this in the other bin. In time, the bins will become much more similar to one another over time, but right now there are going to be little quirky things that are unique to this bin or that bin. But, you know, whenever I've got systems like this that are sort of teamed up as buddy bins or sister bins, I usually do attempt to feed them similarly and manage them similarly so that in time they really end up being very close to one another in terms of, you know, the population and the outcomes that we're seeing. Okay, see this plastic bag is fairly new and fairly see-through, so this is really just here to provide them with a little bit of shade underneath. Okay, very cool. Let's go get the younger bin and get them fed too. So now, I guess just from holding it in my hands, my initial observation with this system is that maybe it's a little bit lighter. I don't know, I'm not sure. Sometimes I wonder if the difference in weight could just be moisture content. I guess if we really start to see a difference, or a significant, notable difference in the weight between the two systems, perhaps we can try to compensate for that and, you know, try to build out this system to have more material in it, if that's really the difference. If it's really just more moisture in the other system, then, you know, I'm not sure we can compensate in a different way to adjust for that. So here, you know, both feeding zone indicators in both systems are holding out pretty good, but since we got a nice brand new one, perhaps this one can just get left in here to be part of what we're doing as we feed and fold it in to the feeding as bedding. And, you know, I guess my first instinct here is to assume that perhaps the reason this one feels a little bit lighter is that perhaps it's because it's a little bit drier. For whatever reason, the material over on this edge feels incredibly dry. So maybe it's really just moisture content. I'm not sure. So now, like I said, this is the system that was launched off in a somewhat more conventional fashion. It was set up as a pre-made bin. It didn't really sit around for very long, but after it had been built up, the worms got introduced, and that was that. So they came pretty much out of their old environment into this new environment, and the worms living in here didn't go through that whole breeder bucket intermediate stage. And I guess for that reason, the system was fed a somewhat fewer number of times, since it was just getting routine feedings in the normal sort of interval that my worm bins normally get fed, versus what I was trying to do in the breeder buckets, which was to introduce a little bit of food every day versus going with large feedings on a more extended period of time in between check-ins. So that's the reason, you know, there was such a wide gap in terms of how many feedings each of these systems have received. But I would say, you know, overall quantity of food that both systems have been given over time is probably pretty comparable, since the breeder buckets were just given a little sprinkle of worm chow here and there. None of those individual feedings really amounted to very much. Alright, so I tried to blend in some of those drier materials, and perhaps when I cover up, maybe I can, you know, try to do a somewhat better job making sure that the entire system is covered up edge to edge all the way around, rather than allowing some of the material to be able to lose its moisture so quickly to evaporation. When a system is still pretty much bedding like this, it's, you know, there's obviously castings beginning to pile up all over the place, but there's a dominance of bedding. I always worry that the material just has a tendency to lose its moisture, and it's something I think we saw right there, evidence of it happening. So hopefully we can you know, prevent that from happening going forward by being a little bit more thorough with covering up things. So yeah, here's a little piece of corn cob. Instead of getting a whole chunk of corn cob with the kernels on it like the other system got, this system received a few chopped up pieces of corn cob. This is, I believe, a chunk of that vegetable matter, very similar to what the other system was exhibiting as leftovers too, going back many feedings, as we saw here. Same stuff. Stuff that's going to clearly take time, but it's also nice to see worms hanging out on this stuff finally. Because after multiple check-ins now of always bumping into that stuff, seeing virtually no activity on it, it's nice to see the worms finally ripping into this stuff. And then once again, we've got these 3 pieces of cardboard. Here it looks like they've done a little bit better on the watermelon, which is cool. Here, this might be some of that pastry. It always feels like after I've gone through bin number 1 and then after I check in on the subsequent bin or bins, I always know much more what to expect. Since, you know, the systems are managed very similar to one another. Pumpkin stem, I don't know why. Pumpkin stems always seem to really attract the worms, you know. I don't know if it's because they like the tough material, being able to rub up against it or whatever the case may be, but for whatever reason, it does seem like the worms do enjoy hanging out on pumpkin stems. And getting down into it, I guess, there's little crevices and holes and gaps within the material that they seem to like to crawl down into. So I guess I'm just gradually excavating the contents of this feeding zone so we can go ahead and plop in today's portion. This, I believe, is maybe a piece of banana. Maybe a piece of banana that actually had some banana within the peel. Because it doesn't seem like a peel, it seems like a banana that actually has some banana in it still. Alright, here's that last piece of, there were 3 of these in each bin, 3 of these pieces of cardboard. And then I guess the rest is mostly bedding type stuff, a little food scrap here, a little food scrap there. And certainly a good number of worms hanging out in here too. It does seem to me like both bins have pretty nice sized populations, somewhere between 1750 and 1800 in each bin. And I think that those are probably pretty accurate numbers just from looking at the number of worms that are congregating around the foods that they've been given. I mean, look at all these worms. They're just going bananas for this last feeding that they got. And I guess my gut instinct is, yeah, some of these old veggies that have been in here for quite a while, quite a few feedings, that are finally getting a little bit of attention. It seems to me like, you know, the I guess maybe it was really just the watermelon rind. Really appeared to me like it had been, you know, gobbled up a lot more than what we saw in the other bin. That's probably the only real indicator, which suggests to me that maybe this bin is a little bit more productive, oddly enough, considering it had that dry section to it. Well, hopefully we can, you know, hopefully we can nurture things back to a point where the entire system's got a good bit of moisture in it, and we could better protect it from the drying effects of evaporation, the dry winter air within the house from the heating system running, constantly drying the air as it warms it. I guess it's just one of the hazards in the winter time that you have to guard against, is the drying effects of the heated air. I mean, that's not common for everyone. It's kind of, I guess, depending on the type of heating system you have. Since I've got forced hot air, it does seem to me like the air gets heated out, dried out, as a result of the heating process. Not like what I remember having when I was a kid in the house, or the apartment, I guess, where I lived when I was a kid, as well as the house that I lived in after that, when I ended up moving in at my grandparents' house. I never had forced hot air. It was always baseboard heat, and it was always much different than it is now here. in the house that I own now. With the forced hot air, it just seems like things are a lot drier. So it takes a little getting used to. All right, I gotta say, both of these bins are a lot of fun to check in on. And it's usually, you know, because they're well populated. Otherwise, it might be a little bit boring, but it is kind of cool coming into these bins, finding all these worms, mobbing the food that they received last time, doing their best to try to work the stuff down. Here's that old coffee filter. We'll just include it down here with the food since we've got a nice replacement to put in its place. And then hopefully we can get the covering on here in such a way that it doesn't keep letting the system dry out. I don't even remember. I guess when I watch the video, I'm going to be looking to see what things looked like on this edge, why it was so dry when we first came in here. My guess is that we just didn't do a very good job covering up previously, but we'll take greater care this time to make sure that we're protecting this system from losing its existing moisture content to evaporation. As time goes on and the system starts to become more dominant with castings, it'll be less likely to lose its moisture to evaporation. The castings just guard really well against drying and they hang on to their moisture incredibly well. But these are still somewhat young systems that are not quite there yet, so that's the reason I like to try to help them with, you know, plastic coverings to protect against the onslaught of evaporation and the dry air, drying them out and making things inhospitable for the worms. You know, the worms really do need the moisture. It's important for them to remain happy and healthy in their environment. And I don't think that, you know, what we saw there in the beginning was terribly hazardous. A little bit dry, yeah, but I think we can account for that just by blending it in and hopefully by covering up a little bit more thoroughly to prevent further drying, and I think we'll be on the road to recovery from that pretty quickly. I don't think that there's real reason for concern. I mean, these plastic bags are large enough to go edge to edge on a bin this size. It's probably just a matter of being a little bit more careful to make sure that the coverage is, in fact, thorough enough to guard against drying. Yeah, I think we're in good shape. All right, everyone, that's it for our check-in with the European night crawlers. Very fun systems, I gotta say. Very nice to check in and see such good activity and a lot of healthy-looking worms hanging out. And they're gradually working down the foods that they get over time, but some stuff takes a long time, so that's the reason I like to be pretty generous, you know, giving them stuff that they can just get right into and feast on. And then in time, they'll get to some of those slower composting items and break them down too. But some things just require time. That's just the way it is. All right, everyone. We're pretty much done here. I got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away. Not going to waste your time with that because that stuff's boring. But before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.